Hi everyone, let's talk about poetry this week. Now, I am not going to claim to be any kind of expert at teaching poetry, far from it. However, I've got around 30 years' experience and I have made a lot of mistakes over the years, but also I've picked up a lot of tips through my own experiences, but also from other teachers. So let's go over some of those now. Right, first of all, choose your poems wisely. Here's my criteria for me and the way I like to teach poetry. So first of all, I look for a poem that tells a story. So everyone gets sick of me going on about this poem, but Mother to Son by Langston Hughes tells a story. Six Young Men by Ted Hughes tells a story. After the Board Meeting by Fleur Adcock. Muhammad Hassan's Customs, a love story, love that poem. And anything by Glenn Colquhoun, I absolutely love as well. They tell stories. Another thing is, can students visualize it? Can they visualize what's happening in the poem? Next one, does it have punctuation in it? This often makes a poem easier to read. It flows better, so therefore it becomes easier for students to understand. And the next thing is, start with a short poem. An easily accessible poem, just so students get used to the vibe of the thing, the vibe of poetry. Next tip I thought of only recently, actually. Start your poetry unit with jigsaw puzzles. So surprise them by giving them 15 minutes or something like that to work on some jigsaw puzzles. Now, you can get these cheaply from secondhand stores, and no, it doesn't matter if there are pieces missing, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So when the time is up, you can point out to students that, okay, so and I suggest you write this on the whiteboard as well. They couldn't see the picture to begin with, right? Well, obviously it's on the front of the box, but they'll get what you mean in a minute. So, and they're looking closely at the smaller pieces, at the individual pieces to see what their features are, what they do, and how they fit together with other puzzle pieces. And they are putting all those pieces together to form a big picture. Now your students are primed for your big reveal. And this is what you tell them. That's exactly what it's like reading poetry. You're putting all the pieces together. So they don't necessarily understand a poem straight away. You can't see the story straight away. They've got to work at it by looking at the individual pieces, just like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, I mentioned losing a piece of jigsaw puzzle or not even having it there if you bought it secondhand half the time. So that's a bonus, because then you can say, well, we don't always understand everything in a poem, but we are able to see enough. You can still see the picture when there's a piece of jigsaw puzzle missing. So same thing with a poem. You might not understand every single line. However, you can understand enough to get that picture. So there you go. Now, with that last tip in mind, do keep pressing to students that it's okay just to get the gist of a poem at the beginning. They don't have to fully understand it, and then refer them back to that jigsaw analogy, right? So you're just getting the gist at first. They've got to pick all the pieces together and picked all the pieces up and put them together to help them see the picture. So the gist is good enough. So I think, oh yeah, there's some blues, some greens here. It's probably a jigsaw puzzle of the sea, okay? But then they've got to look at those individual pieces to move from the gist to the full meaning. Another one I've only recently thought of, and because I was thinking about how a lot of teachers start their lessons with a big question, and I've never really mastered the art of that either. However, if you're doing another unit like a writing unit or a novel unit or something, but as a lesson starter, you put on the whiteboard one line from a poem that students are going to study soon, and say to them, okay, you've got 2 minutes or 1 minute even to write a quick response to that line, or you've got 2 minutes to come up with 2 questions about that line, and just leave it at that. They don't need to know that it's from a poem that they're going to be studying, but So the good thing about that is that not only will they be a bit more familiar with the poem when they do come to study it in that next unit, they'll also be used to looking closely at just a few words and focusing on that vocabulary. So that's a really helpful tip there. And of course, they're practicing responses and critical thinking and all of that. This next tip I picked up from an NZATE conference years ago, and it is to have students highlight the punctuation. That way they will read to the punctuation rather than pausing at the end of every line. So doing that helps them find meaning in that poem. So get them to go through and highlight the punctuation first. So that's your full stops, your commas, colons and semicolons, and also the em dashes. They feature a lot in poetry. Okay, with punctuation in mind, and getting students to read according to the punctuation to help with meaning is this next tip, and that is get them try to knock on the head their tendency to pause or stop at the end of every line. Now, one thing that I have done quite a lot with this is I'll put up an excerpt of prose on my big screen, and then I'll scrunch in the margins and say, look, now it's poem, and then you bring it out and, oh, look, now it's prose, now it's poem. Now it's just to get them used to that concept, because then I get them to read that passage pausing at the end of every line. And do it yourself. Take a page from your novel and pause or stop at the end of every line. It doesn't make sense then. And so that's the whole point that I get across to the students when with this activity is that, yeah, you don't necessarily pause or stop at the end of a line. Look at the punctuation first, and then later on they can make meaning. And obviously sometimes you do pause at the end of a line, but they just in that habit and they just assume that you do. But mostly we flow on, don't we? So that's a little tip there. Knock that on the head and use prose and squash it in to help to do that. Not to break your little hearts or anything, this is something that you will know. Do make sure that your students know that you pause for a comma and a colon and a semicolon, really, and you stop for a full stop. So they don't know, even the seniors, what punctuation means a lot of the time. So make sure that they know that. And you know that they don't know because they write you a paragraph and there are no full stops in it, but there are plenty of commas. And if you ask them to read it aloud to you, you see them stop and take a breath when they get to a comma. It's like, why? No, you only do that for full stops. So just reinforce that lesson as well, because that's going to make a difference to how they are able to read the poetry. And of course, poetry is an oral tradition. It's meant to be read out loud. I don't like reading it out loud really, but I can hear it in my head. And so that's where that punctuation is so important. Another little tip that I picked up from conference, take out the extras, the extra information that comes between any em dashes or brackets. That way students can then focus on the main message, and then you can slot that extra stuff in later. So I'm just going to move over to the side here because I'll put some stuff up on the screen behind me. The ether behind me. So let's read this. Scales are sticky missiles. Dad's knife forcing takeoff as he runs it. The sound like a shaver over thick whiskers along a stiffened snapper. So if we then take out the sound like a shaver over thick whiskers, it's easier to understand. So scales are sticky missiles. Dad's knife forcing takeoff as he runs it along a stiffened snapper. Boom. Now that they've got the gist of that, I can plonk that extra information in. So you can see how that might make a difference to students in particular whose literacy is not really up to scratch, or they're struggling with that side of things. Or if it's a complex poem, like that's one way of making it a little bit simpler. Right, this one I really love doing. Have students, once you've looked at it a little bit and they've got a little bit more than the gist, perhaps have them write the poem out as prose. That way they will really understand the story behind the poem, the message, well, not so much the message, but the story behind the poem, the meaning of the poem. So have them write it out as prose. Key, annotation. Annotation is everything. Students absolutely must have a paper copy of their poem. And I know budgets are tight, so get them to copy it out. Put it up on your big screen. So one stanza at a time, and have them copy it out in their books. It's not going to kill them, and it'll help familiarize them with the poem. So they must have that paper copy of the poem so that they can annotate it. When you get them to annotate it, model it for them. Show them an annotated poem. So they can see what that looks like. Because sometimes for some students, the idea of scribbling on, a printed piece of paper is a bit taboo. So just the more scribbles, the better. But show them an example. Annotation is everything. Nail the poetic features. So the figurative language, the sound devices, the structural devices, students have to know those like the back of their hand, and that frees up brain space for thinking about the content. It's so difficult to read and analyze a poem when you're thinking, oh God, is that a simile or a metaphor? Rather than thinking about what that simile is showing us, is illustrating, and why the poet might have used it. So they need to move on from that at high school. They need to know this stuff. And the only way to do, well, there's a couple of tips for that. 3 tips actually. So give the students their those features in categories. Don't give them an alphabetized list. I've said that in heaps of posts and things before. So figurative language, put all that stuff together in a list. Sound devices, put all that stuff together in a list. Structural devices, and that can include rhyme and rhythm, remember, because they are structural as well as soundy. Caesura and enjambment, I never know how to say that. End stop lines, extended metaphors, structural elements like that. So they all go in a third list. And the other thing is give students ways to remember, tricky ways to remember their vocab. So students always get simile and metaphor mixed up. So I always say, well, simile is the one with an L in it for like or as. Done. So the other one's metaphor. Personification obviously has the word person in it. The assonance is an ass of a rhyme. Hyperbole, hyper means too much. So does hyperbole. Okay, little tricky things like that. And then insist that they rote learn them, test them, staying in at blimmin' interval. I don't care. You've got to learn those things. And, when you've got seniors that still don't know what a simile is, like, how can you move on to content? Take no prisoners, I reckon. Anyway. This next one is key to writing about the poem. So get students discussing the example, not the technique. So while they should name the technique, obviously, in their writing, they must actually focus on the example, because often as soon as they name the technique, they give a definition of it, and that's as far as they go. So, for example, he was a lion in battle, compares the soldier to a lion. Yep, that doesn't tell you anything about what we imagine. So that's what they need to focus on, the example, not the technique, if you know what I mean. I have to say, if you've made it this far, congratulations, and also apologies because I keep looking out the window because it's actually Friday night and I want to leave the office. But anyway, let's get on to the next tip, and it is in line with talking about the effect of techniques, and that is to ensure students imagine figurative language. So ask students to imagine this metaphor. He was a giraffe on the basketball court. So they've got to imagine a giraffe on the basketball court. Knobbly knees, probably sliding around, huge long legs, getting in the way, knocking people over, tall as, can easily, like probably taller than the hoop kind of thing. So there is the effect. So because they imagined it, they can describe the effect, what it makes the reader see. From there, you can get them to move on to purpose, because you can say, well, why does the poet want us to see that picture, to see him like the boy like this? So that is really key. They've got to imagine the figurative language. And the same thing with sound devices. They've got to imagine some of those sounds, and that makes a huge difference when they're describing the effect or explaining the effect later on. Look out for contrasts. Students find it really easy to look out for opposites, but they won't do it unless they're prompted. And they've got to know that that's a thing in poetry. So obviously it's not every poem, but a lot. So look for contrasting vocabulary, contrasting figurative comparisons. And look also for the swift U-turn that many poets do. So the big but, as I've heard it called as well, where the poet might, for example, spend 2 stanzas discussing the beauty of something, then the last 2 stanzas, the next 2 stanzas talk about the evil of it. So it was a beautiful rose, but it killed me, that kind of thing. Another example would be with contrasting seasons. So think about the colours, apricots versus blues and greys, shiny green leaves versus the dead boughs of skeletal trees, that kind of thing. So that contrast and that U-turn as well, which is often a thing. Students have got to read behind the lines, and I get students to imagine the poet sitting at their desk and typing up this poem, and have them think, how is that poet feeling? Imagine, have they got a big box of tissues beside them? Are they like bashing the keys angrily, that kind of thing? So they're thinking about how that poet is feeling. So there's your tone, right? The other thing that you've got to look at with behind the lines is the context. Well, what's the context behind this? What's gone on in this person's life, in this political situation, in the social situation, that kind of thing. So and that gives that extra dimension to their understanding. Thinking critically, apart from taking on the behind the lines stuff, there's the four big things that I use, and that is get students to connect the poem with themselves, obviously. I get them to connect with the world, so events from the past, the present, or people, past, present, and future. And also get them to think about what's illustrated about human nature. So that's the third thing. And the fourth thing is they might be able to connect this poem with other texts, other poems, either by the same poet or by something, similar subject, but by a different poet. And maybe that subject is treated differently by that poet. So that's right, taking things to the next level with that critical thinking. Last but not least, let students choose their poems. So a good idea is to take one poem that students will find accessible. So there's Your Mother to Son by Langston Hughes, because it's got all the things. It's got the context. It's got the extended metaphor. It's got amazing language features. It tells a story. It's got everything. Anyway, so take something like that. Teach them to read the poem. Teach them to analyze a poem, and then bring in, 10 of your favorite poems and a few copies of each, and say to the students, rightio kids, away you go. You choose 2 poems or 1 poem, however many you want, that you like the look of, and you are going to analyze those. And then it's easy to roam around the room as they analyse them in future lessons, because they've already got the skills, can write a list of skills on the board to remember. And then they analyse poems that they like, and they do it themselves. So they've got some ownership there, so they've got some agency. Nobody likes to read something that they hate. So that's one way to get them to buy into this poetry caper. Right. I hope these tips help. Bit of food for thought maybe for some of those things, and hopefully it'll make things easier for you. See ya!